They said separate but equal. But did you know black students were using textbooks 15 years out of date if they had books at all? One boy dared to cross the line, and what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about American education. Miss this, and you'll never know what they tried to erase. It was 6:17 a.m., and the Alabama sun hadn't even thought of rising yet. The dirt road outside Pine Ridge was still soaked from last night's rain, turning to clay beneath Isaiah Brooks' worn-out shoes. Each step made a squelching sound, but he didn't slow down. His breath puffed out in the cold morning air, mixing with the fog like smoke from an invisible fire. Slung across his back was a canvas satchel stitched and restitched so many times. It looked like it was holding itself together out of sheer will. He'd already been walking for 40 minutes. Up ahead, the road curved around a field of corn stubble, and just past it, a sound. Isaiah knew by heart the low growl of the Whiteville school bus engine. He stopped walking. The yellow bus came into view, gliding through the fog like a ship, headlights dull and tired. Inside were kids like Clara Monroe White, clean, still half asleep, bundled in coats and cradling lunch pails. Clara always sat in the third row, near the window, her nose pressed to the glass like she was looking for something. Isaiah wondered if today she might see him, if she might wave. The bus kept coming, fast. Isaiah took a step off the road and onto the muddy shoulder. He didn't want to get sprayed again. When the bus passed, it kicked up a wave of cold water and gravel that hit his pant leg. The driver didn't glance his way, neither did any of the kids, except maybe Clara. A flicker of movement in the window, but it was gone too fast. Isaiah stood still, watching the taillights disappear into the fog, that deep mechanical rumble fading into nothing. The bus never stopped for him. It never had. It never would. Down the road, Clara Monroe pressed her forehead to the glass, the cold biting at her skin. For a moment, she thought she saw something on the shoulder, maybe a figure with a bag, a flash of brown cloth against red mud. But then it was gone, probably just a tree stump or a trick of the light. The bus heater hummed softly. She turned back to her notebook, where she'd been doodling a pyramid. They were studying ancient Egypt this week. Miss Carter said they'd be building their own pyramids out of sugar cubes tomorrow. She smiled. Back on the road, Isaiah trudged forward. The walk to Pine Ridge Negro School was 3 miles. The school was really an abandoned church building, no insulation, no electricity when it rained, and the roof had a hole right above the back row. There were 40 students and 2 teachers. No janitor, no librarian, no playground. But Isaiah didn't care. He liked numbers. He loved the way they didn't lie. 2 plus 2 was always 4, whether you were white, black, or invisible. His mama used to say, "Boy, you were born with books in your blood." She'd ironed his shirt the night before, even though it had a tear on the side, and stitched his satchel for the 3rd time this month. One day, she said, "You gon' walk into a building where they ain't never seen a boy like you, and they gon' have to listen." Isaiah smiled at the thought. He walked a little taller. The wind picked up. The sky turned a pale blue. Ahead, the silhouette of the old church school emerged through the mist like a secret place. Isaiah adjusted the strap on his shoulder, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "I don't need their bus. I just need one chance." He stepped through the schoolyard gate. As the bell rang, an old iron cowbell tied to a post. And just like that, the day began. But the bus didn't stop. It never had. The old church that served as Pine Ridge Negro School stood crooked against the wind, like it was holding on to life out of stubbornness alone. Its white paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind weather-beaten wood that looked tired just from standing. The bell that marked the start of the day wasn't in a tower. It hung from a rusted iron hook nailed to a fence post, and it didn't so much ring as it clanged, like a dinner bell on its last leg. Inside, the building smelled of chalk, mildew, and hope. Isaiah stepped in, wiping mud from his shoes on the mat that read "Welcome" in faded letters, though no visitor had likely crossed that threshold in years. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him as he entered, some tired, others alert, and a few still sleepy-eyed. The classroom was nothing more than the main sanctuary of the church, with the pews repurposed into desks, and a blackboard nailed crookedly to the wall where a pulpit once stood. Thaddeus Moss, known simply as Mr. Moss, stood up front in his pressed white shirt and fraying brown slacks. His beard was gray, his back slightly bent from years of carrying more than just books. But his voice still had iron in it. "Morning, scholars," he said, eyes scanning the room with gentle authority. "Math first today." Isaiah bored. Isaiah didn't hesitate. He slid past rows of makeshift desks and grabbed the dusty chalk with ease, like it was an extension of his hand. Mr. Moss began calling out numbers. 67 times 23. Chalk scraped the board. Isaiah's fingers moved fast, sketching the multiplication in columns, carrying digits in his head, erasing and correcting mid-flow. 1,541, he said without even turning. Mr. Moss nodded. Correct. A few students clapped softly, half in admiration, half in disbelief. "Now, Mr. Moss said, pointing to the battered wooden box labeled Donated Books, "find the Alabama State Arithmetic Standards, page 42. Isaiah reached in and pulled out a tattered book whose spine was missing. The inside cover read Property of Whiteville Elementary, 1921. It was 1935. Most of the books in that box were cast-offs discarded from white schools when they were deemed too old. Torn pages, outdated maps, broken bindings. But Isaiah read them like scripture. Every word was fuel. Every number, a stepping stone out of the mud he walked through every morning. Mr. Moss handed out worksheets handwritten, photocopied once a week using a borrowed machine at the colored church across town. Isaiah's sheet had smudges. The ink had bled. Didn't matter. He finished first. Again, when Mr. Moss collected the papers, he paused at Isaiah's. He didn't smile. Mr. Moss didn't believe in making geniuses feel special. He believed in making them unstoppable. He slid the paper into his satchel and said, "Isaiah, stay after class." Some of the other boys snickered. One girl whispered, "He's in trouble," but Isaiah just nodded. He wasn't nervous. He trusted Mr. Moss. When the final bell rang another clang from the old cowbell, the children poured out into the yard for recess. Most didn't have lunch, just a piece of cornbread or half an apple. Isaiah sat on the front steps, waiting. Mr. Moss came out, took a seat beside him, and pulled the worksheet from his satchel. "You got all 20 right, again," he said. "But more than that, you showed work cleaner than most of the white schools I've taught in." Isaiah blinked. "You taught in a white school?" "Briefly," Mr. Moss said, eyes far away, till they realized I wasn't the janitor. They sat in silence for a moment. "You ever think about testing for the Whiteville County Scholars Program?" Mr. Moss asked. Isaiah's head snapped toward him. "That's for I know who it's supposed to be for," Moss interrupted. "But there's no law says a boy can't dream. And there's no law says a teacher can't help him try." Isaiah's heart pounded. The Scholars Program was the golden gate to real schools, boarding prep academies up north, even college scholarships if you tested well enough. He'd heard rumors, but no colored student had ever even applied, let alone been accepted. "I don't think they'd let me sit the test," Isaiah whispered. Mr. Moss nodded slowly. "They might not." Another pause. "But we'll find a way." That night, Isaiah stayed late at the school, helping Mr. Moss clean chalkboards and reorganize the book pile. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but he didn't notice. He was flipping through algebra equations 2 grades ahead of him, working silently by oil lamp. Somewhere deep inside him, a fire had started. Not the kind that raged with anger, the kind that burned slow and steady, like coals in a forge, waiting to shape something strong. At home, Isaiah's mother sat sewing by candlelight. She looked up as he entered and asked how school went, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt beside her and held out the satchel. "It tore again," he said quietly. "I tried not to run so fast, but..." She took it without a word. Her hands already knew what to do. "I might need it stitched up a lot this month," he added. She looked down at him, squinting in the candlelight. "Why?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Because I'm gonna go somewhere they never seen a boy like me." She didn't say anything. She just nodded, pulled her needle tighter, and stitched like her son's future depended on it. Because maybe it did. The paper felt heavier than it should have, just a single sheet, folded twice, ink smudged slightly from his sweaty palms. Isaiah sat in the back of the church school that night, long after everyone had gone home. The wind rattled the boards, and the lantern beside him flickered with each gust. On the table in front of him was the completed exam, 25 math questions, all solved, checked, and rewritten in the neatest handwriting he could manage. But the name at the top wasn't his. It read, Thomas Monroe. He stared at it for a long time. Thomas was a white boy who lived just down the road. They'd spoken once, maybe twice. Once when Isaiah had helped him free his bike from a ditch. Another time when they'd both reached for the same apple at the county market. They weren't friends, but Thomas didn't look at him the way most white kids did. He didn't flinch, didn't sneer, and most importantly, he'd said yes. 2 days earlier, Isaiah had caught him near the edge of the field where the white school let out for the day. He waited until the crowd had thinned, and Thomas was alone, kicking a stone down the path. Isaiah approached cautiously. "You like numbers?" he asked. Thomas blinked. "What? Math. You like it?" Thomas shrugged. "I guess." "Why? I'm good at it," Isaiah said, pulling a folded worksheet from his pocket. "Really good." Thomas looked down at the paper, then up at Isaiah. "Okay." Isaiah hesitated, heart pounding. "There's a test, Whiteville County Scholars. They only let white kids in. But I think I can pass it. I just can't use my name." Thomas stared at him for a long beat. "You want to use mine?" Isaiah didn't speak, he just nodded. To his surprise, Thomas didn't laugh. He didn't walk away. He simply said, "They'll know it's not me." "Not if I don't win," Isaiah said quietly. "But if I do, I just want to know what would happen, just once." And now, here he was, alone in the classroom, staring at the fake name he'd just written across his only chance. That night, he walked home under a moonless sky. The stars above him sparkled like pinpricks in a black curtain. Crickets chirped. Somewhere, an owl hooted low and long. At the kitchen table, his mother was boiling potatoes. She didn't turn around when he entered. "You're late," she said. Isaiah sat down slowly. "I had to finish something." She turned then, her eyes finding his. "You've been real quiet lately. Something you need to tell me?" He hesitated, then slid the test paper across the table, upside down. She picked it up, turned it over, and stared. "Thomas Monroe, it's the only way," Isaiah whispered. She closed her eyes, like she was bracing for a storm. Then, with a voice so low it was almost a breath, she said, "They catch you, Isaiah. They don't just tear up your paper, they tear you down." "I know. And you still gonna do it?" He nodded. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached for his satchel, inspected the seams, and began stitching it again, slow, precise. "When you get there," she said softly, "you keep your head high. You write like the world depends on it. 'Cause for boys like you, maybe it does." 3 days later, Isaiah walked into the Whiteville County Courthouse alone. It wasn't the place most people imagined taking a test, but for colored students or anyone pretending not to be one, it was the only way in. The examination room was cold, with stone floors and thick glass windows that distorted the light. Isaiah sat at a desk far from the others. Nobody looked at him, nobody spoke. The proctor, a tall man with a thin mustache and a tighter mouth, eyed him like a fly that had landed in his soup. Isaiah kept his head down and his pencil steady. The test was harder than anything he'd studied, but he didn't flinch. He worked through each problem like it was a riddle meant just for him. In the middle of the exam, the proctor stepped behind him. Isaiah could feel his breath. "You from Monroe's school?" the man asked. Isaiah nodded. "What teacher you got?" "Miss Carter," he lied. "HM." The man lingered a moment longer, then moved on. Isaiah kept writing. The results came a week later. He wasn't supposed to get the letter directly. It would have gone to Thomas Monroe, but Thomas, bless him, slipped it under the fence post near the old barn like they'd agreed. Isaiah opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Mr. Monroe, we are pleased to inform you that you have qualified for the final round of the Whiteville County Scholars Program. An in-person interview will be held on March 12th at the Whiteville Public School Administration Building. Please bring a parent or guardian and identification." Isaiah stared at the page. His eyes lingered on the words, "Bring identification." His heart sank. He didn't have one. Not for the name he'd used. It was over, or at least It should have been. But deep inside him, that fire, slow and steady, kept burning. He folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it into his satchel. Not as a ticket, but as proof. Proof that a boy like him could get there even if they'd never let him in. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The Whiteville Public School Administration building sat like a fortress at the edge of town, tall, square, and blindingly white under the afternoon sun. The brick looked freshly scrubbed, the steps spotless, and a small, manicured lawn sat just in front, bordered by 2 white benches. No one ever actually used. It didn't welcome you. It warned you, you don't belong here unless we say you do. Isaiah stood at the bottom step, the letter still folded neatly in his pocket. He had borrowed a button-up shirt from Mr. Moss, one size too big and a little frayed at the collar, but it was the best thing he owned now. His satchel was slung tight across his chest, and inside was everything he thought he might need to look official: a pencil, a notebook, and an old envelope with the name Thomas Monroe carefully copied on the outside. He took a breath, then another, and climbed the stairs. Inside, the reception room smelled like floor polish and cold air. The walls were lined with plaques and framed black and white photos of men who all looked like they'd never smiled a day in their lives. A secretary with red lipstick and horn-rimmed glasses sat behind a tall desk, peering down at him like he was something tracked in on someone's shoe. "Name?" she asked flatly. "Thomas Monroe," Isaiah said carefully. She looked him over, then reached for a file folder and flipped through a few pages. "Have a seat." He nodded and sat on a wooden chair by the wall. His feet didn't quite touch the floor. 15 minutes later, he was called into a room with green walls, a round table, and 3 men in stiff gray suits. One of them was the same proctor from the exam hall, the one with the mustache, and the way of looking through you instead of at you. "Mr. Monroe," one of them said. "Glad you could join us." Isaiah nodded politely. "Do you have your identification?" His throat tightened. My father forgot it. He's parking the car. He'll be in shortly." The lie came out smoother than expected, but it landed awkwardly in the room. The 3 men exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward. "Where'd you go to school, son?" "Whiteville Elementary," Isaiah replied. "Miss Carter's class." "You don't sound like you're from Whiteville." My mama's from Birmingham." "That's probably it." The man with the mustache narrowed his eyes. "Funny. Miss Carter says Thomas Monroe had an accident 2 weeks ago, broke his wrist, couldn't have taken that test." Silence. Isaiah blinked. Then he blinked again. The walls began to close in. "Do you want to tell us who you really are?" the man asked. Isaiah looked down at the table. His hands were shaking. The paper with the interview questions sat untouched in front of him. "I just wanted to try." The man slammed his hand on the table, loud enough to make Isaiah flinch. "You forged a state document, impersonated another student, and wasted the time of this entire board." "I didn't cheat," Isaiah whispered. "You lied. That's enough." Another man stood. "We'll be reporting this to the school board. I suggest you leave now before things get worse." Isaiah rose, legs trembling. His eyes burned, but he refused to cry in front of them. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He just walked out the way he came in, down the steps, across the lawn, and back onto the dirt road that had always led him home. The next morning, Mr. Moss was waiting on the church steps when Isaiah arrived. He didn't say a word, just handed him a folded sheet of paper. Isaiah opened it slowly. It was a letter from the county education board. "Effective immediately, due to inappropriate conduct and violations of academic integrity, the Pine Ridge Colored School will no longer be receiving instructional funds for the upcoming term." Isaiah read it 3 times, but the words didn't change. The punishment wasn't just for him. It was for all of them. His stomach dropped. "You think they'd just punish a boy?" Mr. Moss said bitterly. "No. They punish the dream. Make sure it don't come back." Inside the classroom, the air was heavy. The desks hadn't been moved. The chalk hadn't been touched. But the spirit, what little they had, was gone. That afternoon, a truck came to collect the few supplies they had left. Textbooks, chalk, the globe that wobbled when it spun. Isaiah helped Mr. Moss box it all up. "We'll be sent to other schools," one girl whispered. "2 towns away. My papa said I gotta start working in the fields now," another boy muttered. Ain't no point in reading no more, mister. Moss said nothing. He just stood in the doorway, watching the last of his classroom disappear into the back of a government truck. When it was over, Isaiah walked back inside. The sunlight slanted through the windows, catching dust in the air like golden snow. He stepped up to the blackboard. With a piece of chalk, he wrote one word, "Why?" And then he dropped the chalk, picked up his satchel, and walked out the door. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. They'd closed a classroom, but they'd opened something else, something much harder to control. Clara Monroe had never paid much attention to what grown-ups whispered about behind shop counters or on porches with lemonade glasses sweating in their hands. But that Friday afternoon, as she stood with her mother at the post office window waiting for stamps, her ears caught a name that made her freeze. Isaiah Brooks, that colored boy, tried to fake his way into the Scholars Program, said a voice behind her. An older man, balding, his overalls stained with oil. Clara turned slightly. He was talking to another man, both of them standing too close to the sorting table like they owned the place. They say he walked right into the Whiteville admin building, bold as daylight. The second man chuckled, not kindly. Used that Monroe boy's name. What was he thinking? That he could pretend to be white? They laughed. Not like something was funny, like something had been put back in its place. Clara's stomach twisted. Her mother didn't seem to notice. She was busy asking the clerk about holiday envelopes. But Clara wasn't hearing any of it. Isaiah? Pretending to be white. That didn't sound like Isaiah. He didn't pretend. He didn't ask for attention. He walked past their house every morning with a satchel patched and hanging low, eyes fixed on the road, shoulders squared like he was carrying the weight of something too big for one boy to hold. She had always watched him, even if he didn't know. Sometimes she wondered what he was thinking, what it felt like to never get on the bus, to never sit in her classroom, to never be allowed to walk through the same doors as her, even though they breathed the same Alabama air, drank the same tap water, and lived barely a mile apart. And now, this. He tried to take the scholar's test, not as Isaiah, as Thomas Monroe, her cousin. Clara's breath caught. That night, over dinner, she stared at her plate while her parents chatted about church meetings and weather. Her fork pushed green beans into a neat little pile. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "if someone's smarter than me, but they can't go to my school, is that fair?" Her father looked up mid-bite. "What kind of question is that? I just mean..." She hesitated. What if someone tries really hard? What if they're better at math than anyone in my class, but they're not allowed to even try? Her mother glanced at her. "Are you talking about that boy? That Isaiah?" Clara nodded. Her father leaned back in his chair. "That boy lied, Clara. He used someone else's name. That's not how decent folks get ahead. But maybe he had no other way," she said, voice quiet. Her father's brow furrowed. "That's not how this world works. You follow the rules. You wait your turn." She looked up then, right into his eyes. What if the rules are broken? The room fell silent. Her mother stood to clear the plates. Her father didn't answer. Later that evening, Clara sat on her bed with her schoolbook open, but her eyes weren't on the page. She was thinking of Isaiah sitting in that big, cold building with men in suits, asking him questions like he didn't belong. She was thinking of the word she'd seen scribbled in the dust on the side of her school that morning, liar. She knew who had written it and who they meant, and she knew it wasn't the truth. So she did something no one expected. She reached under her mattress and pulled out a small notepad, the one she usually saved for diary entries and daydreams. At the top of the page, she wrote in big block letters, "To whom it may concern." Then she paused and began to write, "My name is Clara Monroe. I am 10 years old, and I go to Whiteville Elementary. Today I heard people say that a colored boy named Isaiah Brooks lied to try and get into the Scholars Program, but I don't think that's the whole story." Her handwriting was wobbly at first, but as the words came, her pen grew stronger. "Isaiah walks past my house every day. He doesn't ride a bus. He doesn't wear new clothes, but he always carries books. He studies when no one's looking. He's quiet. He's kind. And if he wanted to take that test, it's probably because nobody ever let him try before." She kept writing, "I think we're supposed to be the land of the free. But it's not freedom if only some kids get to learn and the rest have to lie just to be seen. That's not fair. That's not right. She signed it with her full name, dotted the I in Clara with a heart like she always did, and tucked the letter into an envelope. On the front, she wrote, "The New York Times. Letters to the editor." She didn't tell her parents. She didn't ask permission. She just slipped the letter into her coat pocket and made a plan to stop by the post office the next morning on her way to school. Because for the first time in her life, Clara understood something. Silence wasn't neutral. It was a choice. And she wasn't going to be silent anymore. It started as a whisper, the kind of thing people skim past over coffee, a short column nestled between obituaries and local sports. But by the second day, it had made the front page. A child's question stirs. A state's conscience, right beneath the headline, was a scan of Clara's handwritten letter, spelling errors and all, published word for word. The editors hadn't cleaned it up. They'd left in every shaky line, every honest sentence. Maybe that's why it hit like it did. If someone is smarter than me but can't even try, is that fair? Point, he didn't lie to win. He lied just to be allowed in the door. Point, if this is America, shouldn't it be for everyone? It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was a spark. In Pine Ridge, Isaiah's mother stood on the porch clutching a wrinkled copy of the New York Times in both hands, the print smudged from her thumbs. She'd read it 3 times that morning already, and was reading it again, slower this time, like she was memorizing the shape of every letter. Isaiah sat on the steps below her, elbows on his knees, not speaking. He had found out the letter existed only an hour before when Mr. Moss burst into their yard waving the newspaper like a miracle. She did it, the teacher had said, breathless. That little girl, she told the world. Now, sitting there, Isaiah didn't know what to feel. His name, his story, his pain spread out in ink across the country. And yet, he hadn't told it. Clara had. He didn't know if that made him feel powerful or exposed. 200 miles away, in a newsroom in Montgomery, editors fielded phone call after phone call. Some praised Clara for her moral courage. Others spat into the receiver, accusing the paper of spreading Negro propaganda and encouraging civil unrest. One letter demanded that Clara Monroe and her parents be investigated for race-mixing behavior. But others, so many others, sent stories. Letters from teachers who had watched students of color get passed over for opportunities they'd earned. Notes from parents who remembered growing up without books, without buses, without justice. A retired librarian in Atlanta wrote, "This child has said what the grown-ups were too afraid to admit." It wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. It never really had been. A week after the story broke, a group of teachers, black and white, held a vigil outside the Whiteville School Board. They held signs with Isaiah's name. A woman sang softly beneath a magnolia tree. The next day, a small protest formed outside the courthouse where Isaiah had taken his test. And 2 days after that, someone spray painted the front steps of the administration building. Let him in. No one claimed responsibility. Isaiah said nothing. But when he passed the photo in the newspaper that afternoon, he smiled, just a little. In Clara's house, things had changed too. Her father didn't speak to her for a full day after the paper arrived. At dinner, he broke the silence. "You made our name public." Clara put down her fork. It was already public. It's his name too. That's why he had to use it. Her mother winced. "Sweetheart, we understand why you care, but this is different. It's dangerous." Clara looked up. "You said to always do what's right. That's not always the same as doing what's good." Her father snapped. "No," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's better." He didn't respond, but he didn't say another word about the letter. Back in Pine Ridge, the old church school remained shut. The books were gone, the desks dismantled, but something strange started happening. People showed up. One day it was a young man from Atlanta, tall, black, and dressed in a tie. Said he was from a volunteer organization. Brought 4 boxes of textbooks and 2 globes. The next day, a woman from Birmingham drove up in a pickup truck full of desks and supplies. Said she was a teacher on leave. Said she wanted to help. They called it the Shadow School. They opened the doors 3 days a week. Mr. Moss came out of retirement to teach again. But now, he wasn't the only one. Others joined, lawyers, retired principals, college students. Sometimes they just came to listen. And Isaiah? He sat in the front row, not because he had to, but because he finally could. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold behind the silhouette of the church, Isaiah stayed late, scribbling numbers into a notebook worn thin at the edges. Clara stepped quietly into the doorway, holding something in her hand. He looked up, startled, but then he smiled. "I wanted to say hi," she said, "and thank you." He raised an eyebrow. "You're thanking me?" She shrugged. "You lit the match." He tapped his pencil against the desk. "You wrote the letter." They sat in the quiet for a moment. Then Clara reached out, handing him a fresh envelope. "This came today, from Washington. I thought you should be the first to read it." Isaiah opened it slowly. Inside was a notice from the Department of Education. "We are conducting a formal investigation into discriminatory practices within the Whiteville County school system. We will be reviewing testing eligibility standards and access to public education across state lines." Isaiah didn't speak, but his hands shook just slightly. Clara smiled. "Told you they'd hear you." He looked at her, this girl, who had everything he didn't, who had used her voice to share his truth, and nodded. "They didn't just hear me," he said. "They heard us." Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Not the clang of an old iron bell tied to a wooden post, but the sharp, clear chime of something beginning. The mornings hadn't changed much. Isaiah still walked the same red dirt road, his satchel slung over his shoulder, shoes patched with careful hands. The sun still rose behind the cotton fields in a slow, golden stretch. The air still carried the scent of dew, soil, and the faint bitterness of something unspoken. But inside him, everything was different. He wasn't just walking to a school anymore. He was walking towards something. Every step carried the weight of letters written, protests sparked, and whispers that had turned into voices loud, persistent, and no longer easy to ignore. The church school had become more than a classroom. It was now a symbol. Kids who had once thought education was something far away now came every week, even from towns over. Some sat on crates, others stood against the wall, but they came. Isaiah sat at the front, as always, but he didn't look down anymore. He looked forward. Across town, Clara Monroe stepped off the school bus and watched the other children race into the brick building. She'd grown up calling her own. Her books were heavy, but her thoughts were heavier. Inside her backpack, folded carefully between two textbooks, was a flyer. Someone had slipped into her mailbox the day before. It was handwritten, with words in bold black ink. "Education is a right, not a privilege. Show up. Speak up. DONT stay silent." Shadow School Rally. This Saturday, Pine Ridge Church. Clara didn't tell anyone she planned to go. She just knew she had to, because when you saw the truth, really saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And she had seen it in Isaiah's walk, in his silence, in the way the system had slammed a door in his face and called it law. Saturday came. The air buzzed with anticipation as families gathered on the church lawn, some in Sunday clothes, others in work boots. A local jazz trio played softly near the steps. Children chased each other around stacks of donated books. There were no microphones, no flashing cameras, but there were eyes, and there were ears. Isaiah stood near the front, fidgeting with the strap of his satchel. He wasn't used to being looked at like this, not with pride, not like someone who had started something worth following. Clara stood a few rows back, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't need to speak today. She already had. Mr. Moss stepped forward, his gray suit slightly wrinkled, but his voice crisp as the wind. "What we are building here," he said, "ain't just a school. It's a promise. One we've waited too long to hear." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "A promise that every child, regardless of skin or name, or where their mama scrubs floors, deserves to learn. Not just to read, not just to add, but to dream. And know their dreams matter." People clapped, not loudly, but deeply, like they meant it. Then he nodded toward Isaiah. And suddenly, all those eyes turned to him. Isaiah stepped forward. The paper in his hands trembled. His knees wanted to lock, but his voice when it came was clear. "I didn't write that first letter," he began, glancing at Clara. But I lived it. He held up the envelope, the original Scholars Program invitation, still creased and worn. This was never meant for me. Not really, just the name I borrowed, but I earned it. I took the test. I passed. And when they found out who I was, they didn't say I was wrong. They said I didn't belong. His voice broke a little, but he pushed forward. I'm not asking to be let in anymore. I'm telling them we're here, we're learning, and we're not leaving. Applause swelled. But Isaiah didn't smile. He wasn't there for praise. He was there to make sure no other kid would ever have to pretend just to be seen. Days passed, then weeks. The investigation from Washington dragged on slow, quiet, drowned in red tape and silence. The Scholars Program offered no public comment. The school board met behind closed doors. Journalists stopped calling. But the door hadn't closed completely, because something had cracked, and light was still getting through. One afternoon, Isaiah returned home to find a small package waiting on the front steps. No return address, just his name, handwritten in careful ink. Inside was a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird First Edition. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. Not every courtroom tells the truth, but every story has the power to reach where laws cannot. Keep writing yours. No signature, just the initials CMISAIH. Smiled. He knew. Months later, a new school year began. No buses had changed routes. No laws had been rewritten. The Pine Ridge School remained unofficial, but in a quiet corner of a classroom still powered by oil lamps and handwritten lessons, Isaiah opened a new notebook. On the first page, he didn't write math. He wrote a question, just one. What would have happened if I'd been allowed in? And below it, he started to answer not as a student desperate to belong, but as a boy who knew the system didn't define his worth. Outside, the bus rumbled past. It still didn't stop. But Isaiah didn't watch it anymore. He was too busy building a door of his own, one that would never close on another kid again. If this story moved you even the slightest bit, if you felt the injustice, the pain, or the courage in Isaiah's journey, then drop a number 1 in the comments to let us know you're still here, still listening, and still believing in a better world. Because here's the truth. It only takes one child's voice to challenge a system. But it takes all of us to make sure that voice is heard. The lesson? Silence protects the system, but your voice, your comment, your share, that's how justice begins. Don't scroll past this story. Be part of the reason it's remembered.